and welcome to another video. In this video I will be essentially diving into the talks about dementia. And what is dementia? Well, essentially, if you were now to look on the previous video that I now just shared regarding a sociological analysis at the measurement of time, you can now actively see that dementia is when an individual can sense a glitch or malfunction in time, which results in essence in their experience. Now, if I may get to the point of the experience of dementia, which is the reason you may experience a sociological analysis of the measurement of time from, because essentially dementia is the moment you align with the moment in time you begin the end, which is also known as the trials of Hercules, in order to make amends for losing his mind. And beginning to understand dementia, imagine now anytime you're faced with a stimulus that causes either PTSD, stimulation of the mind, or a specific trauma response where you in your mind, and not just you yourself in your own mind, because at this point your mind has developed a much more resonant greatness to it, which means it is viewable to the rest. Which means in your mind now, when you have a PTSD trigger or a moment of a trigger point that results in a imagination where you see yourself doing something bad to somebody, you begin the opening sequence that leads into what is known as dementia, which from this particular imagination of you seeing yourself doing something bad, if you then invite and choose to follow that pathway, you enter the demented kingdom, which in itself is of an evil nature. And in order to pull away from the demented kingdom, you must first analyze how you can get to that point, which in essence is as a result of years and years and years of serotonin syndrome buildup, which through this prolonging of serotonin buildup, you essentially create a deeper rooted experience of consciousness, creating it to pull further back into the more fundamental primal regions of the brain, as this nucleation starts from the point of the eyes and then pulls further and further and further and further and further back until the entire regions of the brain have been nucleized. And from this particular portion, you enter a part of life where you can actively sense a trigger in the perception. It's like a spidey sense, you could say. And if it is not you performing something bad to somebody, you perceive it as something bad happening to you, which then creates this state of essential paranoia, which reverts upward into the previous development, also known as schizophrenia, upwards into anxiety. And through this paranoia, you then generate the unstableness of what is known of the individual. If an individual lacks its ability to logically think or intellectually logically process this particular portion, which they themselves might see a perception in time difference, because in their mind they are actively perceiving a mental stimulus that is causing them to see a negative act to occur in space and time. This is as a result specifically due to a short circuit in the nerve cell transferring, which at the Schwann cell portion, if you create a nuclein or nucleation point, essentially what happens to the Schwann cell, what is the white matter of the brain, what happens if you create a nucleation point is the Schwann cell essentially melts. It fries, which is left now with an open circuit, which bleeds everywhere and short circuits to other short circuits, which other people are a circuit of their own. And in the idea of creating a rebalancing of this point, what can you do? Well, you can implement a healthy diet beyond the logical reasoning of your understanding of your particular problem you might have here, which if you experience this particular problem of seeing yourself doing something bad to somebody, or you experience a problem of seeing somebody do something bad to you based on what is known as social anxiety. This is the beginning of what is known as social anxiety, where people are afraid to be in public, and in order to be in public, they require a certain level of mixture of sorts to allow them an easier time being around the main source of their trigger, which is people, as a result of trauma resulted in the experience of people. And so the more we dive into understanding the self behind the demented self, the more you have to analyze it from the perception or perspective of the logical intelligence. Because the moment you can see yourself above that particular rooted experience, you all of a sudden can see, okay, what can we do to change this? Well, for one, let's dive into the diet aspect of supplementation in order to create a neutralization of the brain's neurostructure. If essentially the relaying mechanism for the nerve cell is the Schwann cell, such as the insulation, the black rubber around an electrical wire, which allows the current to progress in one linear pattern in a straight line from point A to point B. If the wire or insulation is now rid, then essentially the wire is not relaying electricity solely within the line, but the entire electricity is relaying throughout all space and time. In terms of the electrical wire, it is exponentially radiating itself based on the initial port of transport known as the wire. The same can be said about a nerve cell, which if the Schwann cell, the black rubber's comparison to the electrical wire, which is now the white matter, the Schwann cell, the insulating portion to the actual neuron, once this fries upon entering such a thing as a nucleation point or a stimulus of either logical or emotional intelligence, this can also occur as a frying portion such as scar tissue, where you see a breakage in Schwann cell matter, or through drug-induced psychosis, which reduces or fries up the Schwann cell by increasing the resonant potential at which the nervous system is firing in its neural capacity, resulting in a greater perception of space and time, which we are calling this hallucinating, which in the understanding of the word hallucination, you derive it from the Latin word hallucinare, which means to wander somewhere, as in to travel somewhere. it also stems the word luz, which in Spanish is the word for light, a lucenary, which as a lucenary, you are a person that actively can alter the perceptions of space and time through the internal light. This is where you see a greater perspective above the diagnosis of dementia. If you do not understand the condition, you do not understand the power behind its nature, which is essentially, well, welcome to the mind, folks. You can remember everything you want and you can think of anything you want. Anytime you think of it, you present yourself within that situation inside your mind. A form of a time machine, if you wish. Now, in terms of the mind and the sociological analysis of the measure of space and time, in order to do so, you need to create your own psychoanalysis of the things you have come to know in your space and time, this life. And based on those particular things you have come to know, you need to essentially draw out the patterns that are similar within the things you have come to know and base those patterns back to your self-experience and how that made you feel. Because the moment you experience the feeling, you experience that particular moment in time. And now you see how memory and imagination work. Memory is the traveling backwards in time. Imagination is the traveling forward in time, which you both see within your mind. And this is what essentially is the demented self when you get to a point where you no longer know where to relocate. And in result, when you do relocate, you are aggressive. And no matter how you relocate and how aggressive you come back, you never gain the higher perspective. And you had to be locked up. Damn. So, let's get you healed up. For one, you need to realize your mind is real. For two, you need to mind your mind is real. And not just based on your mind is real, you need to realize that space and time are a real experience. Which leads to number three, the divinity of a human, which in itself, a hue is a measure of light. And man is the experience of self. And in the experience of self, we essentially get to see the measure of your light. How much are you shining the world for them to move in the direction of the light? And in this sociological analysis, you reflect back on internally on yourself to then re-radiate space-time outwards until you reach a recentric or refraction of said reflection of space-time you will visualize in your mind. And in the sociological analysis, now you begin to see where you can pinpoint the patterns of the questions you want to ask space-time. And in knowing how this particular ability works, you will now understand the patterns of absolutely everything. And it sucks. But it is a power nonetheless, and with great power does not. Because with great power comes a lot of great fear in the people. because of this fear, you become essentially an alienation experience. So, let's get you rehabbed up. We need to learn to process our emotions at the point we now restabilize in the central portion. We now re-experience our central space and time, which in order to do so, you cannot be disassociate from this particular self in space and time. If you become disassociate, you become less likely to be attached to that self, which results in you now seeing a way out. And if you see a way out, you don't see a way back in. Because in the understanding of the fundamental sins of the universe is also the sin of suicide, which in the understanding of this, you yourself as an individual might see that if you see suicide as an option, it is as a result that you yourself do not understand your own logical process of your own internal self, which is why knowledge, or the understanding of the mind, the more you know, the closer you are to the ledge, resulting in depression. And in order to combat depression, you need to gain a logical perspective over it, just as any other mental condition. In order to get a perspective, you need to experience life and exercise in life the things you would wish to preach. You must actively walk that which you preach, which is a very difficult thing to do, especially if you begin experiencing the mental conditions of your mental health battle since a younger age. But in understanding the mental health battle, you will understand that it all stems from the experience of a divine root. Now, in the understanding of the nervous system, which in normal space-time we normally only utilize about 10% to 20% of our maximum neural capacity, which means we are only functioning as people at 20% maximum capacity of our full potential as conscious human life forces. The more you increase the neural activity of said nervous system, the more you would experience a higher and higher and higher sense of consciousness, where rather than perceiving everything in separative patterns of alternate or separate senses, such as the 5 physical senses, you then see another 5 mental senses, on and on and on, but essentially you become one sense, which is just the experience of consciousness in a human experience. And at this point, you can do as you wish, but you have a moral compass. And so, if the moral compass of yourself is good, then you need to heal the moral compass of the rest around you so that they may be good. Which is where you begin, as in your psychoanalysis of yourself, you also begin the socio-analysis of yourself, where you can essentially, within a reasonable amount of time, predict a change in the replicative pattern, essentially leading to you being reaccepted within society. And it starts the moment you walk out of that front door and simply just show you're just a person and not a person of self above. Because that is scary to people. Now, in understanding the frightness behind that particular notion is also a beauty, that in the difference of the individual, we also find its strength, which is also where its weakness is. now we can actively create change. Because now that this individual has become not just self-intelligent, logically, self-aware, logically, but self-emotionally intelligent, logically, you see that all of the processes of its intelligence stem from a logical perspective, which the higher you rise up the logical perspective, you would essentially see that the cranium, if this process began from an earlier point, would essentially rise in a cone-like pattern, which is what humans of ancient times would essentially rise into, an elongation of the rear of the cranium, because of this consciousness pushing further and further and further back into the root of the primal self at the center of the brain's experience. The further back in the brain you go from the point of initial consciousness, where you separate the brain and consciousness external of the brain at one particular central field, the iris. And from the iris is where the external world of consciousness then enters into the internal world, and from there the internal world then exits to create the external world. We are just consciousness experiencing a human existence, folks. And in the ascension from lower life forms, we ourselves take on higher life forms over time, which can be re-singularized in one particular sense experience. You yourself as a human may experience higher states of consciousness. And once we begin understanding this particular concept, we could revolutionize the world going forward, if we learn to use it in the right practice. Thank you.